Hello, everyone who's on streaming this, wherever you are. This panel is, I think, titled something like Emerging Issues. Is it? Emerging on the... We're emergent on this panel. One of the things that I think has come up over the course of the day is how the more of this we do, and by this I mean using particularly new technologies to communicate with disaster-affected populations in new ways. The more we do, the more we kind of find out about what the remarkable potentials of these things are, but also perhaps some of the sort of unexpected problems that sort of just arise, and you don't actually know it's there until you kind of do it. And also some of the problems that have been problems sort of from the beginning of the endeavour. We heard earlier on a colleague from the BBC saying that radio's been doing this for 80 years, and there are still challenges around it. So some of the problems don't go away. So we have new opportunities, we have new challenges, and we also have old challenges that kind of just come back because they haven't been dealt with before. And over the course of today, quite a lot of those things have bubbled up, and hopefully we're starting to get a fix on. It's a very diverse conversation, but we're hopefully starting to get a fix on some of those areas. So the idea of this panel is really to explore those in a little bit more depth, try and get a sense of how the architecture is changing, what does this mean for the work that we do, what would we like to keep, what do we need to do differently to make it work? Those sort of things. And also, perhaps, is it worth it? What do we really get out of these technologies? So to have that conversation, to initiate that conversation, we've got a great panel here. I'll go from left to right, if I may. Paul Currion runs humanitarian.info. He's got form in the humanitarian information world. He was the information manager, I believe, for the WASH cluster in Georgia and Bangladesh. WFP's information manager, or a regional information manager around the Indian Ocean tsunami, and has also done work for information centers in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Liberia. You were also, I think, Paul, the manager of the ICT program with the Emergency Capacity Building Project. Was yeah. For a couple of years. Yeah. So lots of previous there. Adele Waugaman, and have I pronounced that correctly, Adele? Close enough. Okay, thank you. Is a fellow of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. A lot of experience in the area of information management, and particularly ran a partnership, I believe, between the Vodafone Foundation and the United Nations Foundation, a $30 million partnership. More or less. Forget the chain. Which was largely about using wireless ICT for disaster relief and healthcare applications. So a lot, I'm sure, to say about some of these interrelationships between how we talk to each other and the four different groups and how they come together. Derk Segaar, Derk Segaar, was a journalist and has lectured on both sides of the Atlantic, in the US and in Holland. Before doing or while also getting lots of field experience in a list of places which I have here, but which is actually too long to go through for the purposes of time, but at the sharp end of humanitarian action. That took you to being Deputy Chief of Staff for the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And from there, Derk has moved to his current post as Chief of Communications Services in UN OCHA. Derk has asked me to say that he works for UN OCHA, but he's speaking today very much in a personal capacity, which means he can say whatever he likes. So, and finally, last but by no means least, Dr Jemilah Mahmood, who will be familiar to many of you. Jemilah is a research fellow at the senior research fellow at the Humanitarian Futures Programme, and is also, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce this correctly, but is also working with the Khazanah Nasional Malaysia company around research around private sector and humanitarian integration.
Disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction.
Disaster risk reduction, I'm sorry. Jemilah also finds time to sit on the board of HAP, of Médecins du Monde US, on the council of the Overseas Development Institute, and to chair the HIF, the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, about which I hope we will hear more, as innovation has been such an issue here. Previously, Jemilah was Chief of Humanitarian at UNFPA and also founded Mercy Malaysia. So, here is the panel. I'd like to start off, if I may, Adele, by asking you a question that's, I think, come to mind to many of us from the sort of position that you held, where a lot of money was going into looking at new technologies and how they could be used in humanitarian endeavor, which is this hype?
It's a good question, and I think undoubtedly there's probably consensus in the room that there is a huge opportunity, and we've seen since 2005, perhaps a little bit before, a huge amount of money being poured into pilot programs to try to understand how can we make this technology work to meet our needs as institutions. And we're seeing some strong success stories. We're seeing some good case studies of projects being used to meet the needs identified. And we're seeing that mobile is becoming a transformative device. And we know it's disrupting private industry. We're seeing it's disrupting the public sector as well. Citizens with mobile phones are now able to provide input to local governments to say, I'm not getting enough of this service, or I'm getting the service, but I think it's crap. And that applies for the humanitarian sector, as well as we've heard today through some of the presentations. So I think the rise of mobile is not just creating an opportunity to do more communications with local communities, it is changing how we communicate with local communities and changing how we think about distributing aid and how we engage local communities into that process. And so I think there's a graph that I have on a slide, if we could pull that up, please.
Could we bring the slide up?
Thank you. That helps to illustrate this opportunity. I don't know how many people are familiar with this graph. It's called the Gartner Hype Cycle. And it's designed to help organizations understand technology maturity, which tools are mature, when to adopt them. And I think it's a nice metaphor for where we are today. We have the technology trigger, which obviously is being advanced by the spread of mobile phones, the very significant spread of mobile phones. I think the ITU is estimating that we'll have 6.2 billion mobile phones by the end of the year. And it's leading to this tremendous peak of inflated expectations about what this technology can do, particularly for this community that's interested in using this technology in very difficult, very quickly moving scenarios. And inevitably, this leads to the trough of disillusionment, where people walk away from the tool sometimes. They have a bad experience and they don't want to go there again. Or they've heard those bad stories, and so they're reluctant to pick up those tools. And I'm curious, because I feel like over the course of the discussion we've had here, I've heard responses from different people about where they potentially see the community right now. And so I'm curious, how many people, by a show of hands, think we've reached the peak of inflated expectations? Not there yet. So all the concerns we've talked about today aren't even over the peak of inflated expectations. These are all just concerns leading up to the peak of inflated expectations, which I think says a lot.
Well, not necessarily. Perhaps could we just ask, just to check
Sure,
that, actually, because I think it was an interesting question. How many people are already in the trough of disillusionment?
Can you be both at the same time?
Just a couple of hands there. Okay, so yes, I think you're right there, Adele, that we're on the upslope.
On the way up, yeah. So, I mean, some of the concerns we've heard people talk about are the concerns that you hear a lot in the community, concerns about responsibility to respond. If we're aggregating information from the public through SMS, through web, through different channels, and we're providing it in a public forum, are we then compelled to respond? Or can we do that without having a back-end system for the humanitarian community to be able to plug in and meet these needs once they're publicly identified? We hear a lot about ethical guidelines with a lot of these tools. The innovation is moving so quickly that institutions are having a hard time keeping up. And consequently, with the democratization of technology, you have people who are not traditional humanitarian actors taking on humanitarian roles. And so how do we create some kind of guidelines around that? And then best practice in communicating via these new tools with local populations, both, as we've heard today, to send information out as well as to listen and to take that information back in.
I'd like to actually pick up, if I might, on the listening thing, because it's something which has come up several times. This obviously, the high level of expectation, the high potential for this to either improve or perhaps completely transform the way that humanitarians do accountability. And this is something that we heard in the last panel as well. There's been something of a sort of drumbeat over the course of today. Jemilah, I'd like to ask you about this, but before asking you sort of what do you think the opportunities are, how are we doing, one of the things which I often find in this conversation is there's not a clear, I think there's not a clear statement or clear relationship, certainly in my mind, between communications and accountability. Is communications, how are they related? Is accountability just a fancy word for communication, or how do you see these two things relating to one another?
Thanks, Paul. I think that's a really important question because, accountability and communications are two totally different things, and I think that it's always a huge mistake if you think accountability equals communication. I think if you go down to the root of accountability, and in this case we're talking about accountability to affected populations, we are talking about power and how power is shared. Because in any situation where there is a disaster or an emergency or humanitarian situation, there is an imbalance of power. The power that people who are assisting is obviously much greater than the power of those who's receiving. So if you are talking about accountability to affected populations, you're talking about how you give away some of that power. How do you ensure that in the act of assistance, the people who are affected by disasters are making decisions, are participating in the true sense in actually how they are being assisted. Now, having said that, it's a very Western construct because, at the end of the day, in difficult, complex environments, in the many different layers that communities come from, the ability to speak up and say, this is how I want assistance to be, is not there sometimes. I mean, I was listening with interest Maria's presentation, and I really want to follow up on that, saying, in Pakistan, women don't have access to information. So how do you deal with that? How do you then allow accountability to happen in an environment that doesn't allow accountability to actually happen easily? So these are the things we need to deconstruct even further. And we talked about, complex environments. How do you then get information without it being really putting the person in more danger than he or she already is? So I think Imogen's new report, Are They Still Listening or something like that? Something like that. But, I know I got it wrong, Imogen, she's laughing her head off. But basically, she shared with me that in Haiti, 6 months later, there were large organizations, dare I say, Vision, where their affected population still didn't understand what was feedback all about. So, we use terminology and we construct the way we deal with populations in a very narrow sense, in a way. But communications is this amazing tool now that can help us bridge this, accountability gap, so to speak. And it's an essential tool. And someone said just now, will the communities hold us to account? Of course they will. Look at surveillance, what it's doing now. And even closer to our hearts now, Kony 2012, it went viral, but the accounts went viral too. So, people then started to say, hang on a minute, 30% of their funds are used on the programs. And, it ended up with a pretty clever, tool, a video that had more hits than anything before, and ending up with someone running around on the streets in his underwear. I mean, it's really tragic, but that's the way it's going to be. If surveillance is already happening to governments, why can't the population then hold us to account through the similar methods? So I think we've got to really realize that, the people who are using technology out there may even be a step ahead of us. Now, having said that, I just want to make one point. we're always working in the present. We're always thinking about technology and how we're using it in the present. How about the future? What about situations where you have complete cybernetics failure? How are communities now going to have a means of communicating? And over the break, I was sharing with someone in Bangladesh, one of the organizations that was certified for humanitarian accountability with zero corrective action was actually a small organization in Bangladesh, where the CEO gives his phone number to everyone, and all the affected populations are not affected populations, but what they call partners. One of them sits on their board. Now, he gets called and texted for all sorts of things, but he deals with it. And eventually, the numbers of complaints and texts fall, and he actually manages the organization in a better way. But coming back to Bangladesh, when they had their first cyclone, they lost, 300,000 people. And the second cyclone in 2000, Cyclone Cedar, I can't remember the year, now 2006, I think, or 2007, it was like 2,000 people. Why? Because people in the Red Cross communities were going out on bicycles using megaphones and communicating with people in that way. So I mean, it's something to think about. We've got to really think local. We've got to really think what might not fail when the technology we have fails.
So if I'm reading you right, Jemilah, in this sort of relationship between communication and accountability, two at least of the key pieces there are that communication can help accountability to the degree, if I understand you, where it decreases power imbalances.
Yes.
But that those power imbalances are also culturally constructed very often, and so the mechanism needs to, as we've heard on several occasions, the mechanism needs to really be fitting into, and yet presumably also challenging to a degree, the existing way that communication is done around power. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Given that, and given the call that we had earlier on to, what should be the content? We've talked a lot about the media, if you like, but what should be the content? I wondered, do you have any sort of examples of where this is happening and what the content of these accountability, communication for accountability mechanisms are?
Well, I think, again, I'm not trying to, I am trying to market the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, because the grant is there for people to apply for. Certainly, I'm delighted to see what Internews presented in Central African Republic, which is actually funded by HIF. But the Danish Refugee Council example is probably a very good one, where they've had this program on community-based recovery and development, and where they invest a certain amount of money in the communities, and the communities also invest 20%. And plan their programs, and then they use Facebook and other means of communication to actually give feedback and so forth. Now, we funded the next phase, which is using SMS, and I think they partnered with Frontline SMS and OCHA and the group. And what they found is that has been so useful for them to get feedback. A lot of it was actually quite positive feedback, but the side effect that they didn't acknowledge and they didn't realize was that the diaspora was actually watching and was investing money into the system so that they could actually have more money in the pot to actually run the programs. Now, what I'm trying to say is that we still are working within very narrow confines of what we think is the humanitarian community. I think we forget there's a huge diaspora out there. There's other people also watching the humanitarian community and the private sector. Now, what's stopping the private sector that has all the tools and has all the planning done for the next 20, 30 years, which we maybe have not done, to then, go step in as humanitarian actors in the future? I think there's so many examples from Safaricom and these health programs in Kenya and so forth that have shown us this. So they are able to bridge that very, very quickly. I think we need to learn. I think American Red Cross now with the Dell has set up this social media center. I think that's really exciting because it shows that we are using tools that are already out there that we need to just learn from. I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So, I think the Danish Refugee Council example is a really nice one because I like it because, you know what, the diaspora suddenly got involved. And we think about it, $1 billion goes into Somalia from the diaspora every year. Pakistan earthquake, similar amount of money came from diaspora. So, we haven't we're just at this, scraping the surface. Yeah.
We said that we were going to do this panel in a kind of more talk show format. Jamilah's really taken that seriously, so we even had the plug there. And so so a plug for the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, everybody, which I would just like to as the topic has come up, I'd just like to remind everyone that calls for the Humanitarian Innovation Fund for the HIF, for the large grant, will be going out this week. So for those of you who want to put something in, there's still time. That brings me on. Paul, you'd suggested something, and maybe I wondered if you'd just like to take on some of the ideas there that Jemilah brought up, particularly around how we tend to look very much at the sort of binary relationship between the aid provider and the affected population. But some of these mechanisms actually open that relationship up a little bit. Yeah. And I don't know could I just leave the floor to you to kind of to share some of your thinking.
I have nothing to plug, but I can share the thinking. No, I mean, first of all, I'd like to pick up on what Jemilah was saying about power. I think it's worth remembering that although there's issues around accountability and effectiveness when it comes to talking about how technology can improve assistance, really we're talking about a question of power. The aid that we provide is part of a power dynamic. One of the things that I think is very interesting but very seldom recognized is that what the technology is doing is shifting that power dynamic. And in many ways, that's a really good thing. In the collection of papers that everybody got, there's the current edition of Forced Migration Review, which I contributed an article to, and cited a couple of instances in different countries, Indonesia and the Philippines, where local communities, in the face of smaller scale disasters, had been able to use social media to actually organize their own relief efforts. Now, we know that local communities organize their own relief efforts already, but what the technology does is it acts as a force multiplier. It helps them to leverage resources that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access, or to leverage existing resources more effectively. And when we talk about the Haitis and the Pakistan earthquakes, it's easy to remember that a very large number of the people that are affected by disaster are actually affected by those smaller scale disasters. And in those sorts of situations, I think we're already seeing the impact that technology has in terms of empowering people. And not in terms of us helping people to empower themselves. Simply people taking these tools and finding ways of using them which make sense in their context. But in the wider context, I think we need to recognize that that shift in power is going to be across the board, from the mega disasters all the way down to the very small local disasters. And in many ways, as I said, that's a good thing. It helps communities to help themselves. But when you change the power dynamic, you change the entire sector. And what that means is that there's a transformation coming, that the way in which we work is going to change. It will have to change. And what worries me is that we have two choices. We can continue to sort of tweak around the edges, and we can continue to have lots of discussions which are very worthwhile and lead to some interesting projects. But if we continue to do that, I worry that we'll be overtaken by events, by the pace of change. What we actually need to do is to work out how we can transform, and that's where this question of the binary relationship comes in. Because as Jemilah said, there are many more actors becoming important in this context, both in terms of the private sector. We're seeing more involvement from militaries, particularly in natural disasters, from diaspora communities as the lines of communication open up. And what this means is that we're looking at a networked relief effort, much more than we ever did before, where perhaps international agencies were the only channel through which external relief came. Now there are many more channels and many more relationships as a result. And we have to work out how we're going to leverage that, not just because we need our organizations to survive, but because the principles, the humanitarian principles that should lie at the heart of all of these relief efforts, we need to make sure those are embedded. No one else is going to do that. We have to work out how to do that.
Can I just provocatively take that thinking forward a little bit? There is a sort of ultimate direction, end of this road, which is conceivable, which is that the traditional international actors, many of us represent those, the organisations, have very largely, one could say, performed a sort of tube function, moving goods and services from the north to the south. And what a lot of this communications technology seems to be opening up, from what we're saying here, is a possibility where that function is not hugely important anymore, because there are other flows, and there are horizontal flows and flows from diaspora. And I wonder whether you've given any thought to what that means, the 10-year time. We were told this morning to sort of think not for now, but for what it's going to be. What an organisation, what the standard principled organisation that is a part of the international humanitarian system might look like in 10 years' time. What's it doing?
Question.
Specifically with relation to this.
I think the one thing we can definitely say is that it won't look like how it looks like now. Because the one thing we know about the information revolution is it disrupts existing business models. And that impact is only really starting to be felt in the humanitarian sector now. Obviously in the private sector, and particularly in areas like retail, that's had a huge impact. What worries me is that the humanitarian industry could end up like the record industry, sort of staggering along, still there, still doing things, still providing a service, but increasingly marginalized, increasingly less relevant. And as I said, that worries me because of this issue of humanitarian principles, that I believe that humanitarian principles are worth maintaining. In terms of the type of organisation that's going to survive, I think if we look at what's happened in other sectors, and be interested to hear what the other panelists think about this, they have to be flatter, they have to be better networked, they have to be more agile. Most of the big agencies that we have at the moment work on economies of scale, because they can shift large amounts of resources over, whether it's cash, or whether it's food or shelter, they can shift large amounts of resources around the world. That stops being so important, particularly when we recognise that, in fact, there are quite a lot of resources in regions. That's where a lot of agencies are now sort of taking resources from for distribution. I just don't see the current business model of that tube of delivery continuing. That tube of delivery is matched by the way that we deal with information. My experience is that most agencies working in the sector, you treat information as a resource, as something to be extracted from communities, to be extracted from local authorities. It goes up the chain and then adds value to our operation. The reason why everything we're talking about today is really disruptive is because we're talking about a situation where we're going to have to start adding value back on the basis of that information. We can no longer just take. We have to be part of a loop, and the loop has to add value, otherwise people will look elsewhere. And they should look elsewhere if we can't manage to do that.
And the technologies that will achieve this, another issue which comes up a little bit, which I think came up in the previous panel, is the issue of we've talked about what the organisations may look like and the sort of changes they might need to make. But how about many of these contexts are not particularly high tech. I mean, we tend to look at places that are, many of the examples are places which are fairly wired, but many places where humanitarians work are not. The experience of moving high-tech kit and high-tech methods to these contexts, and the translation technologically that needs to occur, both to allow them to function for in these contexts, but also to allow issues of sort of interoperability that we heard about before. What's your experience of that? What's working in terms of transferring northern technology to humanitarian situation? I
think it's difficult to say what's working. It's entirely possible to do technology transfer. The question's about the capacity around it. And one of the things that's worried me for many years now is that everyone's heard of the digital divide. It used to be really a big thing in ICT for development. What worries me in the humanitarian industry is we are in danger of creating a new digital divide. We have situations where our organisations, the international organisations, have access to quite high levels of technology, but we're working with local government counterparts or community counterparts who don't have that. One of the examples of that really stuck out was I did some work in South Sudan on NGO coordination. And obviously the international NGOs all had their VSATs, they had access, they all had mobile phones, they were using email, they were using all these handy tools that we all take for granted. The local NGO council had none of that. They relied on an internet cafe that OCHA had very graciously agreed to host. But when OCHA decided that they couldn't continue with that, they lost all internet access. So they were forced to sort of go around begging from international agencies for coming in and using the computers. And that's a problem not just because they lack the resources, but because it means they're cut out of the loop. If you don't have access to email, and email is the way in which documents circulate and people will communicate with you and tell you about meetings and tell you about donor opportunities, then you are simply trapped in this vicious circle. And so that kind of digital divide, I think, is at the root of the question. How we overcome that is very difficult. I think if you look at the penetration of mobile technology, that's not going away in a hurry. And in terms of when that disappears, mobile technology seems to be the single most resilient communications technology we've got. And the good news is it's going everywhere. So we will continue to be able to rely on that to a large extent. The question is how we make our communications appropriate within that context. And again, that depends on a case by case. And we've heard a lot of good examples of that, obviously, today, using voice or SMS to enact different models of engaging with affected communities.
So we have to be thoughtful about the use of technology, both technologically, but also so in terms of its fitting within the social context and within the power context, if we want to make this work, if we want this to create value for the work that we do, and at the same time maintain a future where work is being done better, more efficiently, more effectively, and humanitarian principles are in the frame. Adele, what else do we need to do?
Well, I think one of the secret sauces, if you will, and it's something that we've heard over the course of the day, is the need for collaboration. And I would stress within the humanitarian sector, that's certainly a need. There should be more and better and continuous collaboration on this front, but also with other sectors as well, with governments, with technology companies, with mobile operators, and with representatives of local populations, beneficiary populations themselves. And I will borrow 5 focus areas that actually come from another sector. I wear a couple of hats. I also do some work with the mHealth Alliance. And I think it's okay to crib from other sectors because a lot of sectors are embarking upon this at the same time with the challenge of technology and what it means. And with the Mobile Health Alliance, the 5 policy or the 5 overarching areas they've decided to focus their work on include policy, capacity building, evidence, fundraising, and of course I'm going to forget the last one. Oh, of course, technology, the big one. And I think that applies well in these parameters also. And you know, for evidence, there's a huge amount that's happening, but do we actually know what's happening? Has anyone gone and done a systematic analysis of what tools are being used and with what effect and what's working and what's not working? And what can we learn from that best practice and lessons learned? I mean, if we could just stop reinventing the wheel there, that would be a huge way to propel the ecosystem forward. With capacity, a lot of tools, it's not just a matter of giving somebody the tool and telling them to go have a nice day. There's a whole training component that's required to make them effectively used. John Crowley talked very nicely about some of the challenges around technology, and a lot of those ideas can be found in the Disaster Relief 2.0 report for people who want to dig in and get more information. And then policies, both within government, within institutions rather, everything from making sure there is sufficient budget line item to enable staff people to go out and move this work forward, to also at the governmental level, what do we need from governments in terms of help navigating this complex space with a lot of different players. And finally, funding. How can we document the ability of these new tools to make the process more efficient and to save money and thereby create a catalyst for further investment in the space? All of this is really important, and if we could work together as a humanitarian community but also with other sectors, I think we could do a lot together.
Thank you. It's not surprising, I suppose, given that we're talking humanitarian, that a lot of the challenges that you bring up here, Adele, and that have come up over the course of the day are common action challenges. They come out of the rather remarkable nature of our sector, which is so incredibly atomized, which is its strength, and also makes things more difficult. You know, the fact that someone brought up earlier on that we didn't know all this stuff is going on. There's different stuff going on. Often it's going on in parallel. Does the code work, but also does the data structure work? I think I managed to say that right. I didn't understand it, but I think I managed to say it right. The degree to which these common action problems are quite, as in so many other parts of the humanitarian endeavour, are an issue for this as innovation goes at quite a speed. Derk, common action problems are really the meat and drink of OCHA at a system level. What do you see that it needs to sort of actually start making, to maintain the gains that have been already achieved and to sort of consolidate those and move forward? What's your sense on what we should be doing, what we are doing there?
To be honest, I don't want to put a dark cloud over this, very enthusiastic debate. But I think we still have quite a way to go at the system level to get this really incorporated in all organizations and in their way of doing their work, to make it basically sort of their standard way of work. I think there's a lot of general buy-in to the concept of the importance of accountability, the importance of two-way communications. That this is the way to go. I think there's a lot of goodwill. There are a lot of very good examples, as we saw today, at field level on how to do it, but usually confined to one organization. At the system level, I think we have really a way to go. One just simple example was that I explained what OCHA is trying to do inside the organization to push some of these concepts forward last week to a good friend of mine in another organization, and he just sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Oh, Derek, this is just your pet project." And this person is very influential in one of the key UN organizations. I will not disclose which one, but it gives you a sense, that this is a person very much linked in and still sees it as a kind of a pet project.
No, if he's watching, we hope he's changed his mind now.
Exactly.
If you're out there.
So I think it's just good to have that kind of reality check, because we here sort of with a group that really believes in it, has a lot of experience with it, but there's there's still quite a bit of resistance at the system level to get this adopted. At the same time, I think we have a real sort of window of opportunity here. At least on the humanitarian side, I assume people are aware of the ISC transformative agenda, kind of the second sort of wave of humanitarian reform, if you will, that has accountability as one of the three pillars of what they're trying to achieve. So I think that in that context, I think there's a way to really push this issue at the system level. If you look at the transformative agenda, the actions that have been agreed under accountability, however, a lot is about accountability for system outcomes or sort of collective responsibility for results, which is a great thing. So it's not just an individual organization accountable for whatever they do in country, but for the outputs of their sector as a whole, or the output of the system as a whole in country. This is, I think, a very important step, and it's great that it's being pushed. The issue of accountability to affected populations, if you look in those agreed action points, it is actually hardly there at all. What you do see, however, is at the working level, there's more progress. I mean, it's getting very concrete in a sub-working group of the IAC on the accountability of affected people. They have a number of commitments there, so there is some progress there. But also, if you look there, it's very much about the commitments, it's about the principles, very little about the practical way of doing it. How do you actually do this two-way communication? How do you achieve real accountability? So, I mean, my sense is really that to move this forward at the system level, at this point, we need to take advantage of some of these wider discussions that are going on, but we need to make a difference at the field level. We need to show how it is done, give good examples, so that it can then, from there, it can sort of trickle up again through organizations, through people's own experience, that they can see, oh, this actually made things more effective, or, oh, we're actually more safe in this really unsafe environment because we have an ongoing dialogue with the people we're trying to help. So I think we need to go to that level to really push things.
Let's go to that level. In terms of this discussion, there's a long way to go systemically. And there's again, the issue of, common accountability requires some sort of common action which preserves the distinct identities, but also allows, common tools, common ways of doing things. What are we seeing happening on the ground? For those of you who are joining the streaming, hopefully we have some colleagues who are actually at the sharp end today. And maybe they would like to contribute to this conversation in a minute. But Derk, from your experience of the field level coordination, what's working?
I think what's working is individual experiments within organizations or small groups of organizations or organizations that work in a certain region that commit themselves to do this. There are some good examples there. I think if you look at the sort of system-wide coordination of these kind of things in country, I think there's very little really that you can see that has a significant impact. And I would say this is where we really need to focus. If we, as soon as possible, I mean, it was mentioned, I think, in the previous panel, that we need some kind of system-wide coordination experiments, pilots in some countries where we try to pull together the two-way communication that is being done with various affected populations. I think two key things need to happen. I mean, one is preparedness, and the second one is the actual hands-on coordination. In terms of preparedness, I mentioned it before. I mean, the importance of understanding in advance or from the very onset the information and communication landscape in a country, that you understand how the local population communicates, that you know what channels they use, so that you can tap into that. I mean, ideally you would have that ready, and we have it ready for a number of countries, but you want to be prepared for that. You want to have done a lot of training, and I mean, I know the CDAC network is investing in that, to have the capacity in various organizations of people who can do that two-way communications effectively. You want to tap into the technological knowledge that is out there, so to help this process along. But what I found really encouraging is I had a chat with Will yesterday of the IFRC, who are concluding agreements with mobile phone companies in advance. They have it in Haiti, but they are planning they'll soon have it in Pakistan. They're planning it in Indonesia, Philippines, etc., where they can tap into their network in advance of any. I mean, they do it for the most disaster-prone countries. If you have this network where you know that there is a way to reach out to these people, and also the communities themselves know where to go in terms of an emergency, how to reach out for help. You can, in a sort of ideal situation, you can imagine that there is a major earthquake. This kind of agreement has already been set up, and before search and rescue teams even arrive, you receive 500 geolocated messages of people underneath the rubble. So, I mean, you don't sort of go in blind as we do now from, okay, let's go and search and see whether people are alive. You get actual feedback from people under the rubble who are able to send these kind of things. Or people send, across a large area, they send geolocated pictures of the situation as they see it. So you come in to help, and even before you touch the ground, you already have an idea of how these are the worst affected areas. You can almost cut out the initial needs assessment because you know visually what is there. You can even think further. If you have this thing set up, people know this is where you go if you need help. You can have sort of remote doctors by Skype if you go at some point, hopefully not too far, to a sort of smartphone thing. You have this whole network thing up. You can really revolutionize. If you have this network set up before disaster strikes, you are really ahead of the game. And I think that this is an area where we need to push in terms of preparedness. In terms of hands-on coordination, just imagine that everybody starts doing this kind of stuff, the two-way communication, and just imagine a little school project where everybody does two-way communication and beneficiary feedback, etc. And then people need to, if they have a complaint about school feeding, they need to feed back to WFP. If they have a complaint about the teacher, they need to SMS to Save the Children. If they have a complaint about the trees outside, they need to reach out to UNICEF. The roof is leaking, it's goal that they need to. So you want to bring all that kind of stuff together. You want to avoid the information overload. You want to make it as simple as possible. So, I mean, what I would see as in terms of coordination, at some point, we need a kind of, I would say, some kind of intercluster working group or mechanism where you have a representative in every sector and every cluster who does the key messaging or the key communication within a cluster, in health, in food, in shelter, etc. And these people come together in this intercluster working group to coordinate what messages are going out. I mean, if you are well prepared, you have the different communication channels, and you decide, okay, I mean, this is the beginning of the emergency. The first thing we need to communicate is where to get food or where to get emergency healthcare. Something like that. That it's all communicated. That these focal points from the different clusters. They do the messaging per cluster. You reduce the amount of interaction with the beneficiaries, but you make sure that it's all that there's as little O8 overlap or message overlap as possible, so as little information overload as possible, and this sort of intercluster group can collect and also the feedback that comes back from the beneficiaries and channel it back to the cluster. I mean, of course, this is all very experimental. We have to see. I think a number of pilots to start working with this could see what is the best mechanism to work at field level. But I think we need to move away from individual experiments and we need to go to system-wide experiments.
Sounds like Derk has a plan for us. Thank you, Derk. On a personal capacity. So,
just in case.
So what some of the many things I'm hearing from this panel, I think, pick up themes which we've had throughout the day. Including the requirement for preparedness, having these relationships in place, having the technology in place, having the skills in place, brings us on to capacity building and the importance of the users, the human side of these things, which also I think probably relates to change as well, and organizational change, the degree to which people are prepared to pick things up. A lot of conversation here around collaboration, and all the way along the line, coordination and collaboration of activities, in terms of joint back ends, but also in terms of analytics and collaborative decision making, because that's actually sort of where the rubber hits the road. The importance of taking in local conditions. One size does not fit all, either socially, because communication is preeminently a social activity, or technically in terms of the tools that can be used. And those are only the things that need to be sorted out in the short term, because, as Paul reminds us, in the long term, we might need to be thinking about completely replumbing and reconfiguring organizations to actually do a different job, potentially, or different kinds of jobs. So those are some of the thoughts that are coming up. What do you think?
One of the things that I think... I don't even have a microphone. Sorry. One of the things that I think that we've heard a couple of times throughout the day is a question of is a call for scale. And I think that one of the questions, being on the tech side of things, is what exactly does scale mean to you, and what does it mean to this community? I think that, is it scale of information? Is it scale of impact? Are you talking about everybody using the same tools? Do we even really want everyone using the same tools? I mean, some platforms, we've talked a lot about SMS, for example, were not designed to be operated at scale, and doing so actually undercuts the value and can harm the infrastructure. So I would be really interested to hear the panel's kind of feedback on, when you're calling for scale, what does that mean, and what are aspects of scale that really define that for you going forward, that we can kind of look at as ways to operationalize that?
Thank you. Perhaps in a second we could put that to the panel, specifically in the context of this idea of sort of, trying it out, of some sort of field piloting thing. But let's take a few more thoughts first. Sean.
I've been really curious about this question of command and control for a long time now, and this might be the audience with this complexity scientists in the room to help me think about this. The humanitarian response, emergency response, requires a certain degree of vertical management to make command and control. But we're also talking about information-rich environments now, and multi-channel communication, lots of different sources. There seems to be a real paradox between words like ecosystem, like adaptive, like networks, and words like coordination, like coherence, like not reinventing the wheel. And I just wonder whether the panel can help us think about this. Is there, a forest doesn't have a central committee that decides how the forest evolves. A coral reef doesn't have a committee of fish who come together and talk about where we're going to expand in the future. And I wonder whether we're thinking too much about controlling the system and managing the system, and maybe we should be allowing redundancy to occur, allowing the experiments to survive or fail on their own.
Very interesting thought, which maybe we can pick up in a second. Other comments, ideas?
I think before we mentioned local government, and it seems there's been very little reference to actually engaging governments as sovereign hosts of crises in communications. And it's certainly a little bit ironic that Internews, which sort of has fierce pride in working with independent media, is now actually focusing on supporting the government of Haiti, building its capacity to communicate with its population. And when we talk about the system, are we thinking about government and local government as well? Of course, we understand that some governments are automatically disqualified because they don't have a credible relationship with their citizens. But do we consider them as part of the system in certain contexts? And what do we think about their needs and capacities? And should we be supporting them to engage in this new field of technology? To Derk's point about needing pilots, I think a lot of this is kind of on the near horizon, and I think it's great to see that we've had some really good research done on the impact of that big investment that OCHA made in the pilot in Haiti, which was in coordination around communications. It was a big investment, and I think we've got the headlines of that, the executive summary, on the tables around us today. And coming back to tools and coherence of messaging, DFID has invested through the BBC and Internews in a process of developing generic messages that have been developed very closely with all of the clusters. So I think a lot of this is kind of closer to us in terms of within our grasp than we actually realize.
Maybe we take one more thought.
I wanted to, I think we're on, take up the issues of power, the power dynamic changes that are coming about from all of this. Ultimately, almost all the funding, whether it's coming from taxpayers or coming from individual donors, comes in from individuals who don't necessarily have a complete loop into the beneficiaries. Here, as we've seen more and more interactions between citizens across countries through the various media channels that are available, we have a connection where the citizens in England or in the United States can interact directly with the Haitian population and begin looking at seeing how the organizations are performing in the field. And I wanted to take this up from Colum's question. How long is it before we begin to see this dynamic begin mobilizing collective action to squeeze both the local governments and the international organizations, and potentially also change the notion of what it would mean for the UN to engage in listening to the constituency and then squeezing back down the other side?
So there's so many ideas there and so many yet to come. I'm being given the tea for time. I don't know if anyone has a right off the bat response to anything that they heard there. Some very interesting stuff about organic, should we be trying to do command and control? Should we allow the system to self-organize and create redundancy? Interesting ideas, which perhaps maybe we just let it happen, maybe this is happening anyway, and we allow populations to take the lead rather than attempting to take the lead ourselves. The role of government. What does scale look like? What scale? Any straight off the bat thoughts? 30 seconds each. Paul.
In terms of scale, I'm a big fan of letting 1,000 flowers bloom. The problem is data standards. I don't care what tools people are using, what platforms they're using. On the humanitarian side, we need to get our act together and agree basic standards for gathering, sharing, and analyzing data, full stop. That, if you have 1,000 flowers bloom, you can then get an ecosystem which then naturally selects the things that work. The second problem is we don't have a natural selection mechanism. That's a question for the donors and for the large-scale humanitarian organizations. We need better selection mechanisms to cull out failures and learn from them, and to promote successes and learn from them equally.
Thank you. Where is Darwin when we need him?
Indeed.
Derk.
Do we need government? Absolutely. I think they should be part of the preparedness process. I mean, I think it's almost impossible to get this kind of agreement with a mobile company, for example, in advance without full cooperation of the government. They won't just let you use this sort of vital infrastructure. Also train them and maybe put somebody within local or central government as a liaison. I mean, you want to be transparent globally. You want to be absolutely transparent with your local or national government and get them fully involved. With the caveat, of course, that you have certain protective conflicts where you need to tread very, very carefully. But without clear engagement with the government, we're not going anywhere.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Jemilah a slightly different question, recognizing we have about 2 minutes. And that question is, what now? This room, what do you think this room should do now?
Okay, before I answer that, I just remember it's still left in the dark. No, Listen is the second publication. As I read all your publications. Well, what now? I think I want to just make an appeal to the clever people in this room that are the media tech people, is let's focus on long-term things, resilience of people so that we don't have to keep responding to the disasters. How do you use media, technology, communications to improve that resilience? How do we look at more preparedness for communities? But if I can just say that what now as well is that if we are going to make any progress in really understanding accountability in communications for affected populations, let's have the affected populations in the room talking to us as well. Because I think we can talk to the cows come home, but the bottom line is they really have the solutions. We need to listen.
Thank you. Adele, what now? What now for all of us?
So I think guidelines across sector that can help us understand how we can take a coordinated approach to this challenge would be incredibly useful, and not one to miss an opportunity to make a plug. I'm pleased to share that I'll be partnering with Internews and others to work exactly on this question of best practice, lessons learned, and recommendations that can be made around the use of two-way mobile-enabled communications with local populations based on lessons learned, best practice, and an active dialogue with this community. So we're very much looking forward to talking with the people here in this room and those working online, and hope to make a contribution that way.
Great, thank you. Paul, what now?
I think the drink.
I think you're right. There is an idea, Derk, I'm not going to ask you again because I think you put forward a very clear idea of where we could be going next. And I think we leave that to members of this group organically, without any central command and control, like the coral reef, to create that, although perhaps a little bit faster. So thank you very much.